Hello everyone, this is Professor Hill, and this is a short video for our class, Introduction to Ethics, Philosophy 2306 here at St. Philip's College. Today is Friday, the 23rd of March, and we're in week 9, and we're talking about international humanitarian law, and specifically we've been looking at a program put out by the International Committee of the Red Cross called Exploring Humanitarian Law. With that in mind, now we've had a chance to look at their first module, get an introduction to humanitarian law. We're applying it to a case study so that we can look at and think about ethics and talk about theories of morality. Now, we talked a little bit about the ethics, a little bit about the law. I want to come back to the IHL piece. And I said that we would talk about whether or not it applied. Now, in this particular case, we're talking about the assassination of Chris Hani, the South African leader. He was killed outside of his home Easter Saturday, as a matter of fact. It was the 10th of April, 1993. And there was a witness who saw this assassination and immediately reported it to the police. So our first module is talking about humanitarian values, our responsibilities, our ethical and moral obligations to one another. But it's also part of this introduction to IHL. So we had this conversation. The question of the week, the case study is, did the woman involved have an obligation to report the assassination that she saw? And she did. She picked up the phone, called the police. He was promptly arrested, charged, found guilty. In fact, the person, Janice Wallace, he's actually serving a life sentence for the murder of Chris Hani. And it turns out that our question, though, on the legal side was she obligated by IHL, by the rules of international humanitarian law, to report this? And the answer, which might be a little surprising to you, is the answer is no. And here's why. It turns out that international humanitarian law is a law that deals only with armed conflicts and regulates them. It's a subset of a larger thing, which is international law. So there's a big thing, which is international law, and then one small subcategory of it is IHL. Well, it turns out it's only going to apply in these recognized situations of armed conflict, and that has kind of a technical definition, which excluded, believe it or not, the South African struggle for freedom. It was not considered an armed conflict underneath the definition of IHL. And in fact, whether something that describing the nature of a conflict is a threshold issue as to whether IHL applies or not, and that's a very controversial decision, whether or not the parties involved in the conflict fall under their obligations spelled out in the Geneva Conventions. Now, interestingly enough, the government of South Africa, of course, did not want this to be categorized as an armed conflict. And so they went out of their way to say, no, listen, this is a situation that's happening completely within our borders. It's an internal conflict. And even though that can have certain exceptions, they were saying it's a matter of law and order, of public policy, criminality, our national law applies. You guys should all back off. And they were able to argue that successfully throughout the entire process. Nelson Mandela is released from jail in 90. This shooting happens in 93. But even from the 60s, all the way through the 70s and 80s, and into the 90s, it was never declared an armed conflict under international humanitarian law, and therefore had these rules applied. Although there's an exception to that, interestingly enough. It turns out in 1980, the ANC, the African National Congress, made an official statement to the Red Cross, to the ICRC, saying that they were going to bind themselves to the rules of IHL, even though they weren't required to. And so they said, we're going to um, respect the rules of international humanitarian law, even though we might necessarily not have to legally. We think it's a good idea to be bound by this. Now, there's another interesting piece of this too, which is that even though some place might not be bound by the rules of IHL, there is another thing which does apply, and this is it's called the Martens Clause. And what that just says is this: look, as they were negotiating the Geneva Conventions, they were saying, look, there's going to be some situations which are going to be bad. There's going to be armed conflict. There's going to be disputes. There's going to be a need to have some control over this conflict. But it might fall outside of our definition of IHL. And so they developed this paragraph. And it's very short, but it said, look, guys, don't forget, even if IHL doesn't apply, it's only one little category of a larger international law. Don't forget that still binds people. And so it says this. It says, until a more complete code of laws, the laws of war, is issued, the high contracting parties think it right to declare that in cases not included in the regulations adopted by them, so think South Africa, populations and belligerents remain under the protection and empire of the principles of international law, as they result from the usages established between civilized nations, from the laws of humanity, and the requirements of the public conscience. And that's great language for us. It was tweaked a little bit later, but what they're saying is, listen, don't forget, you can't just say, aha, we've been technically excluded from the definition of IHL. It doesn't apply to us, so we can do anything we want. No, you can't. Because they're saying, look, the whole reason we created these laws and rules and regulations under IHL is because of our shared humanity, because of the public conscience, because we think that there are some principles, or at least some values that we all share, that will still restrain parties from acting in ways which are contrary to these principles or shared values. Now, I got to tell you, that's interesting language about the interplay between ethics and law. And so just like in my last video when we were talking about the drowning person on the beach, you might not have a legal requirement to hop in that water. Although, again, don't forget, like a lifeguard would. It's their job, and they're out there, and they're supposed to do that. The law recognizes a special relationship. You actually have an obligation to get out there and swim after that person if you're a lifeguard. But if you're just somebody walking down the beach, we're not going to put that obligation on you. It might be morally admirable if you did that, if you took action and you went out there and saved the person, yay! But we have to make sure we're clear about this distinction between morally or ethically required and morally or ethically aspirational or admirable, because those are two different things. So I want you to think about, back on the legal side of this, I want you to remember the lesson here, because we're going to get into some other aspects in the next 2 or 3 weeks about IHL, and about how and where and why it applies to our case studies. That, don't forget, we're still looking at this as ethics, right? We're students of philosophy looking at ethics, and we're thinking about, does it apply or not? And here, between both the non-application of IHL because it's not deemed an armed conflict, and by the way, I put up a link on the announcement about why that's the case. If you're more curious about why it got excluded, there's some details there. But also, don't forget, the Martens Clause brings us back to the ethics piece. And it says, hey, don't forget, even if you're technically outside the definition, we're not going to hold your feet to the fire legally. Don't forget why we do all this. We do all this because of our shared humanity, the requirements of the public conscience. There's a fundamental element there which we want to respect, whether it's based on principles whether it's based on shared values, we're still going to say that don't forget, you're not completely unrestrained. Of course you are. You're restrained by our humanity. You're restrained by the public conscience. So that's the thought for the day in terms of the assassination of Chris Hani, in terms of our case study. Don't forget, like I said, it's Friday the 23rd today. Your contribution and two, not one, but two comments on classmates are all due Sunday the 25th by midnight. If you got any comments, questions, concerns, let me know. Contact me through the Canvas page or send me an email. Look forward to talking to you. Take care. Bye-bye.